Washington, D.C. office. We are privileged to serve as a long-standing supporter of the Aspen Security Forum and believe this event is important to promote dialogue on the leading issues of today, including economic security, sustainability, and inclusion. Today, I have the high honor and privilege of introducing an esteemed guest and keynote, General Charles Q. Brown, Jr., who has dedicated his entire life to a career of public service. As a command pilot, he amassed more than 2,900 hours across numerous airframes and in combat. And his experience commanding the Pacific Air Forces lends enormous credibility to his depth of understanding of the complexity of the challenges we face today. In June 2020, General Brown was unanimously confirmed by the Senate as the Air Force's Chief of Staff, making history as the first African American to lead a U.S. military service. His Accelerate, Change, or Lose plan is not just a coalescing vision across the Air Force, it's a call to action to empower almost 700,000 airmen to respond to the challenges ahead. As a member of the Joint Chiefs, General Brown is leading the Air Force through its 75th anniversary and accelerating the change necessary to meet the challenges of today and long into the future. On behalf of our firm, please join me in welcoming the 22nd Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General C.Q. Brown.
Hello, I'm Courtney Kube. I'm the Pentagon correspondent for NBC News, and I'm honored to be up here today. I have about 9,000 questions for General Brown, so I'm going to get right to it. As soon as I sort of wipe the vision of David Sanger on dancing on TikTok out of my head, then we're going to get started. General, thank you for being here. I want to start with a little bit of news that you made on the flight out here with our colleague Phil Stewart from Reuters. You said that it's possible that the US and some allies may begin training some Ukrainian Air Force pilots. So the question is, what platform would the US potentially train them on? And would this mean the US might sell them, say, F-15s, F-16s?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I think what I said yesterday wasn't necessarily making news, it was actually highlighting some things we're already doing. What I would offer to you is the aspect that for the past 25 plus years, the US military, particularly with our state partnership program, has been working with the Ukrainians, which is actually why they're fairly successful in the things they're doing in their conflict against Russia. I can't speculate what aircraft that they may go to, but I do believe that we have an aspect and a responsibility, like we do with all our allies and partners, to be prepared to train them in various capabilities and capacities. And so, as the Air Force Chief of Staff, I often think about how we organize, train, and equip for ourselves. After spending last week in Europe with 67 of my friends, in an event sponsored by the Royal Air Force, we had a lot of time to talk about how we train together for our common defense, and it's no different with Ukraine. And so part of this is understanding where Ukraine wants to go and how we meet them where they are, and then look at capabilities not only from the United States, but all of our allies and partners have an interest to ensure that Ukraine can provide for its own security.
But presumably we wouldn't be talking about MiGs, because the U.S. doesn't, and that's what we've heard a lot about from the Ukrainian Air Force. I mean, it is possible the U.S. could sell or provide Ukraine with some U.S. fighter platforms then. You think that's possible going forward?
There's U.S., there's Gripen out of Sweden, there's the Eurofighter, there's a Rafale. So there's a number of different platforms that could go to Ukraine. Probably not MiGs. I think it'll be tougher to get parts in the future. Yeah. From the Russians, so it'll be something non-Russian. I could probably tell you that, but I can't tell you exactly what it's going to be.
Okay, great. Bernadette talked a little bit about your extensive background with the Air Force. In March of 2014, you were became the director of Operations, Strategic Deterrence, and Nuclear Integration at U.S. Air Forces Europe and Germany. So, critical time right before Russia's last invasion of Ukraine, and one of your roles there was nuclear deterrent, which of course the Air Force has the nuclear deterrence mission as well. How should the US respond if Vladimir Putin decides to use a tactical nuke inside Ukraine? Not against a NATO ally, but isolated into Ukraine.
Well, that's really a policy question. And so I really can't tell you how we should respond, because that's really for the president to decide. Our responsibility as the U.S. military is to provide the president options and to be ready when the president calls and says, and asks for those options, and we talk about the risk associated with those options. And that's our job as military members. That's one of my jobs and roles and responsibilities as a Joint Chief, is to provide that advice. And so it'll be something we will be prepared to do as far as responding to the president's options based on the events and how the president decides to take action or not.
So the Air Force is actually tasked with achieving the objectives if nuclear deterrence fails. So can you walk us through, I mean, what are some of the realm of possible options if in fact Russia uses a nuke in Ukraine?
Well, there's one to, let me start with my role as the Air Force Chief of Staff is Organized Training and Equipment. And STRATCOM, Admiral Chaz Richard is actually the one who will actually provide those options to the president. And as a Joint Chief, will as I said earlier, I will look at some of those options.
The Air Force would potentially carry out those options.
We're part of the, we have two legs of the triad.
Yeah.
ICBMs, bombers, and then there's the aspect that the Navy has. But we also do have a relationship for nuclear activity with our NATO partners as well. And so all these would come together, and I think there's an aspect of you need to understand what happens and what message we want to send, but it's all about deterrence. The goal is not to get into a conflict broader than the conflict that's already going on today, and definitely not into a nuclear conflict. And so I think the one thing about our United States and what we're able to do, we provide, because of our strategic deterrence, we provide an umbrella of security with many of our allies and partners. And we've got to be responsible about how we do that. And so, there's a range of options that you could do, but by the same token, there's a lot of risk. We want to make sure that those range of options don't lead us down kind of a slippery slope that we can't recover from.
Another area that's fraught with risk, and you know well, is the Asia Pacific. Before this job, you were the PACAF commander. You did a couple of assignments in Korea. How do you think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has impacted China's calculus on a potential invasion of Taiwan? So do you think it has encouraged them, discouraged them, changed the timeline at all? Do you think it's had any impact?
I think it has an impact, but I don't know what it is. Current events that are going on in Ukraine, I think we're all learning something. Ukraine's learning something, Russia's learning something, NATO's learning something, the US is learning something, Taiwan is learning something, the PRC is learning something, and the rest of the global community is learning. Realize we're only about 4 months into this, and it's not over. And so the lessons learned, and book of lessons learned, is not closed yet, and there's probably more chapters to be written. But I do think they are taking a look at, and one thing, how the international community came together so quickly when sanctions, they are taking some action to protect them from economically. From a military standpoint, I'm sure they're trying to pay attention to how Russia proceeded, how Ukraine is reacting, and so from that perspective, I can't tell you what kind of timeline. My role and responsibility is to make sure we're as prepared as possible. It's one of those areas that we got to continue to pay attention to as we assess what we think they're learning, how that may change the calculus of how we need to operate and how we provide in our capacity and capabilities, ensuring we're modernizing and those kinds of things to be prepared. The goal there is deterrence, but we want to be ready.
I mean, one thing that has been different about the conflict in Ukraine is the contested airspace that's been consistent throughout. Are there any early lessons that the U.S. Air Force has learned from that and how you might operate in a future conflict?
Well, it's not an early lesson, it's a lesson that I think we've known for a long time, the value of air superiority. And it's not guaranteed. We've operated for the past 30 years in areas where air superiority wasn't necessarily contested. That's not going to be the case in the future. And this is why, for the United States Air Force, with our allies and partners, with our joint teammates, we are focused on how do we provide capability, capacity, how we modernize, because the threats of the future is not going to be the threats that we see today. And providing air superiority allows the freedom of maneuver to execute military operations in support of whatever options that the president decides to execute.
You mentioned the threats of tomorrow. I mean, you also served as the commander of the de-ISIS campaign at Al Udeid. How do you think the next air conflict, the next commander, how do you think that it's going to be different for that person in a future conflict than what you encountered in the de-ISIS campaign a couple years ago?
Well, the threat will be definitely different. You know, the ISIS didn't have an air force. Yeah. They didn't have air defenses. Those are things you're going to have to deal with. I also look at the various domains that we'll have to operate with more jointly. We already have allies and partners, and we had a lot of allies and partners that operated during the Defeat ISIS campaign. But two things that really changed and really will play a factor, we really started to see how cyber played a role in aspects of military operations during the Defeat ISIS campaign. It's going to have even a bigger role as we go into whatever the next conflict's going to be. And then space is also, now with General Raymond as having a space force, I'll also tell you there's a number of air forces or other militaries around the world that actually have space or more space dialogue. And that part's going to be contested as well. I think we'll be more distributed in our operations as how we operate. We'll actually be using more technology. There's the aspect of crewed, uncrewed platforms teaming together. And so there's a lot of different dynamics that will change the way we've been fighting. Particularly, people talk about the last 20 years. The United States Air Force for the past 30 years, we've been focused in the Middle East where the threat is not quite the same of the threats we might face in the future. And we've got to be thinking about how we would operate in that particular environment.
Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean about how the cyber will be different potentially in the future?
Well, Ann Newberg was up here a few minutes ago and talked about the aspect of offensive and defensive cyber. It's our ability to communicate. It's our ability to influence and how we move information. I mean, cyber actually is a way to help move information, which actually helps to deter, assure, change behavior. It's a way to confuse by putting in deceptive information into cyber. So there's plenty of opportunities in cyber, and I think we are all highly dependent on moving information to make decisions. And we got to protect it, but we also want to disrupt it for our adversaries.
I want to turn to some specific, more domestic issues. There was an interview that came out overnight with one of your colleagues, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, General Martin, where he said that it's possible that the Army could miss their recruiting goals by up to 25%, and that next year could be even worse, and they're cutting their end strength, which is a big surprise. But first off, I know different services, but will the Air Force meet their recruiting goals this year, active, Guard, and Reserve?
We will, and if we miss them, it'll be by just a little bit. For all the services, we are focused on recruiting. And the one thing that I highlight when I go out and talk is that young people only aspire to be what they see. And one of the things that we ought to think about is our military has gotten smaller, so they have less opportunity to see us, but they have a chance to see a lot of other things because they carry information in the palm of their hand. And so that does create a bit more of a challenge for us because we're all competing for our best talent from our nation to whether serve in uniform, serve in some other capacity, go into industry. And so for us, we've got to actually, in some cases, we have to work a little harder because the competition has become more keen, and it's important. But we have great people as our recruiters. As a matter of fact, I was at a 4th of July event at a NASCAR race celebrating our 75th anniversary and had a chance to enlist about 25 airmen, but at the same time talk to our recruiters about the things that they're trying to do to connect. And we got to realize that the generation that's coming in today is much different than the generation that came in with me. And we've got to figure out how to meet them where they are and show them the great opportunities. I will tell you, for me personally, I've been to, just like Admiral Fagan, I've been to every continent. My dad said growing up, you'll get a chance to see things most kids don't see. He's a retired Army officer. I will say, as an Air Force senior officer, I've been able to do things most people haven't been able to do. And if I read my own biography, I still pinch myself of all the things I've been able to do. I've had such great opportunity, and that's one thing that's the beauty of our serving in our military.
Is the Navy getting the whole bump from Top Gun Maverick? Or are you guys getting any on that?
Well,
just even a little bit?
Well, maybe a little bit, but if you go to the movie, get there early because you can see the Air Force recruiting commercial before the...
There you go. There you go. I mean, one thing, you mentioned this sort of growing civil-military divide and the fact that there are just fewer parents who served in the military, and those are major influencers for young adults who might join if they're not, convincing their kids to join. Besides that, though, there was a DoD survey that found that more than 50% of the people who were surveyed, and these were in the key recruiting demo, they worried that if they joined the military, they would come out potentially physically and even emotionally broken. And I suspect that's out after more than 2 decades of conflict and so many stories about wounded warriors. How are you, and I guess how are your chiefs, in sort of your chief's hat, how are you dealing with that? Because that has the potential to really be like a generational change in people wanting to enlist or join the military.
Well, one of the things I found is, young people want to serve, but they want to serve maybe in a little different way. But it's how we have a number of programs to support airmen and families. And, part of this is how we communicate the things that we're doing to support them in these areas, whether it's in mental health or other areas. One thing that I would highlight that my wife, who is very committed to this and how we support airmen and families, she started as a grassroots effort that they call 5 and Thrive. And it's the 5 key areas that are important to families. It's childcare, education, healthcare, housing, and spouse employment. This is a program I had nothing to do with. She set it up with a group of spouses, and it's kind of taken off. And it's those areas that I think are important, but it's the positive things we talk about versus there's a lot of reporting of different aspects, but I will tell you a lot of times the military leads the way in certain areas to drive change and take a look at ourselves to improve processes to take care of airmen and families. And that for me is a personal thing that I want to make sure that they have the quality of service, the quality of life, so they all can reach their full potential.
You've talked about that in the past. At Council on Foreign Relations a couple months ago, you specifically said that as the chief and as a leader, you have a responsibility for the welfare of the airmen and women. And I'm just curious, the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court, have you thought about what the Air Force, or even what the chiefs would do? I know that it's a policy decision and it's OSD, but if an airman comes to you or comes to the Air Force and says, I don't want to serve in Lackland, I don't want to go to Texas, I don't want to go to Alabama, I'm worried about my health, I'm worried about my spouses, my dependents. Have you thought about how the Air Force or the services might deal with something like that?
I have, and I'll just give you a little background about our family that may help give you a little of my perspective. The first thing we've got to do is we have a responsibility to comply with the law, but we also have an obligation to take care of our airmen and their families. And one of the things that we do have in the military is called an Exceptional Family Member Program, where if your family has some specific needs, we can take a look at where you might be assigned. And so our oldest son is on the autism spectrum. And so this is something we have dealt with throughout our career as far as making sure wherever we move to, we had the right level of support. It's no different in this decision or anything else that impacts our airmen and their families. And I would say the same thing for all the other services. We take this seriously about how we take care of them. And it becomes a retention aspect as well. Yeah. And part of this is we can't do an industrial age kind of assignments process sometimes. We've got to do a little more personal in some cases to support those families based on each of their family dynamics.
I want to ask also, a couple of years ago you released a video, got a lot of attention after George Floyd's death. And I've watched it several times, and while the message is extremely strong, the one thing that I continue to be struck by is just sort of the raw emotion and anger. You were visibly angry and emotional in that video. So I'm wondering, and specifically for those who aren't familiar with it, you talked about how oftentimes in your Air Force career, you were the only African-American in the squadron room, the only African-American officer, and now you're the only African-American on the Joint Staff and the Joint Chiefs. Have your feelings changed at all since you made that video? Do you feel better about where the state of race relations is, whether in the Air Force, in the military, even the country?
Let me start off. It was full of emotion. And partly because it was a conversation with my son that spurred me to do that video. But that emotion was based on my own experiences as well, that I had felt throughout my Air Force career, actually throughout my life, to be honest with you. I do think things are getting better. And the one thing about George Floyd's death, as tragic as it has been, is open up our nation to conversation. And the conversation that happened inside of our Air Force, inside of our Department of Air Force with the Space Force, has been really helpful. Because too often it was things like this we didn't talk about. We talk about it much more openly today. And the key part is not that we talk about it, it's the things that we're doing to work diversity and inclusion for everyone. And as I work through this with the senior leadership of the Air Force, there's 3 things I'm focused on when we talk about diversity and inclusion. The things we do have to be meaningful, which means our airmen and guardians got to feel like that, whatever policies we put in, whatever policies we take out of the way that create barriers, it means something to them. It's got to be sustainable, which means we got to resource it. We got to put money behind it if it requires money. We got to put personnel behind it. We've got to have leadership involvement, and we've been doing that. And the last one has got to be enduring. It's got to be something that's going to stick around well after I'm gone. I don't want things to be a flash in the pan, and then we, 5 years from now, we look back at whatever happened to fill in the break program, or whatever barrier we took down came back up, or another barrier comes up. Those are the things that I think are important, and I do believe we're making progress. I would say particularly in the Department of the Air Force, and I'd say I'm a little biased, I think we're doing pretty well compared to the others.
So one thing, in preparing for this, I asked a number of people what they wanted to hear from you, and overwhelmingly, I heard that people wanted to hear more about you. And you've shared some of that, your family's special needs, your wife is, Shireen is very involved in military families, but I'm gonna do sort of a lightning round of get to know you questions here. Right. Don't worry, it's gonna be fun, it'll be fun. Okay.
These were not my prep package.
Yeah, it's fun. So, self-declared introvert, are you still? Has that changed at all since you became the chief? No,
I'm still an introvert. My wife gets upset when I go home and she says, did you use all your words at work today?
Yeah.
Pretty much I did.
It's good to know. At the National Press Club last year, you said that your plan was to get in the Air Force, spend 4 years, and then get out. How'd that work out for you?
I've overstayed my welcome by about 30-something plus years.
Yeah, best laid plans, right? So I suspect if I ask you what your favorite job in the Air Force has been, you would say F-16 pilot, is that correct?
Well, there's aspects of each of the jobs. If you don't mind, I'll probably one of my most favorite opportunities when I was a F-16 weapons school instructor at Nellis. I got to do everything that we could ever do in F-16, and I got to instruct. I love teaching. So that was one. I think the other favorite one was assignment to Aviano in Italy. We were about an hour north of Venice. It was our first overseas assignment as a family. Our boys were about middle school, high school. But at the same time, my last month of command was the first month of the Libya operations, and we're doing combat operations from Aviano. So I got a chance to lead that. Leading the Defeat ISIS campaign in the second year of that campaign, and watching how our airmen and our joint team and the coalition came together, and just watching how we planned something in the Combined Air Operations Center and watch it come to life every day. And then I'd say this job, because if you always want to be in a position where we can have an impact, and that's why I continue to serve. And what better place to do that than the Chief of Staff of the Air Force? And that's my goal, is to make things better for our airmen. I tell our airmen that they don't work for me, I work for them. My job is to make their job easier.
Most people don't count the Pentagon as their favorite assignment, by the way, but.
Well, I've been there 4 times, so you kind of get used to it.
So what's been your least favorite job?
Oh.
You can say chief, it's okay.
Nah, well, I don't like the bureaucracy in the Pentagon, I'll tell you that. Yeah. So there's some downsides to everything we do. But I quote, you can quote me on this, and I've quoted this many times. Every day is a good day, just some days are better than others.
Yeah. You frequently visit airmen, and you ask them a question, what is your superpower? Why do you ask that, and what is your superpower?
Well, I'm a big Spider-Man fan. I still got comic books from middle school that I've kept. When I give a leadership presentation, I talk about the Avengers, and Spider-Man is one of the Avengers, although when you look at the movie contracts, he's on a different contract, so he can't be in the same movie with him. But in comic books, the Avengers, and you look at the Avengers, and if the Avengers all had the same superpower, would they be the Avengers? And so I ask our airmen about that question and go around the room with them when I sit down with them to go, we would not be the most respected Air Force in the world if we all had the same specialty, we had the same background, we had the same superpower. And so we asked them what their superpowers. And so what I share with them for me is I like taking complex issues and breaking them down into something simple that we can go execute. I like breaking down barriers and solving problems. It does pretty good at work, but it doesn't always work at home.
So, I would say, I think your wife's superpower maybe.
She crushes me when I'm fixing problems and tells you I don't need your help.
You still haven't said what your superpower is. Is it Spider-Man? Is it so you?
Oh no, it is.
I don't know what that would be.
No, it's taking difficult problems. Okay. It's not you don't have a special cape or anything. It's just really I like one of the things that when I share with our staff is I want to have the meeting after the meeting in the meeting. Too often we've all been in meetings and no one says anything in the meeting, and then they get in the hallway. Not everybody's got an opinion. So let's have that in the meeting because I like listen to the friction. And then once I hear the friction, then I can go, okay, here's what we're going to go do. Because I've heard from everybody, and then I'm going to drive, and then I'm going to try to drive action to get us to a point where we need to move forward.
Very quickly, your call sign is Swamp Thing,
right,
from when you ejected out of an F-16 that was on fire over the Everglades. Did you think that was the end of your Air Force career? If not, once you realized it wasn't the end of your life, did you think it was the end of your Air Force career?
I was a bit frustrated because it happened just before the selection for weapons school. And I had to apply to weapons school 3 times before I got in, pretty competitive. And so it was, it's one of those things you just, it's a God-given thing you can't control, but it was very unique. And our checklist says, my wingman, a brand new guy who was on a training mission with us, he said, you lost your centerline gas tank. So the centerline gas tank exploded, cut a hydraulic line, caused a fire right away. And he says, okay, you got a little bit of fire back there now? And then later he said, okay, there's a lot of fire back there now. And so I'm over the middle of the Everglades, and I know that there's houses and everything else, so I just said, okay, I'm at the Homestead 290 for 21, I'm punching out. And I was in the parachute long enough to think about, I hope there's nothing down there. But the interesting thing was, I punched out on 15 January 1991. I spent the night in the hospital, and the next night Desert Storm kicked off. And I had a lot of buddies and friends that were serving in, so it was a really interesting dynamic for that to happen to me, knowing that that could happen to somebody in combat. And, I was lucky, it was a Coast Guard helicopter that came and picked me up. I spent about 15 minutes out in the swamp mud, and that's why I got Swamp Thing. So when I came back, my parachute landing fall, I fell on my left side. So I was covered in swamp mud on my left side, and in my boots and everything. I was back flying the next week and flew like 7 times in a week, so it was actually still a good week.
Swamp Thing was born. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it, and for being candid about a little bit more about you as well. We appreciate that.
Thanks, Courtney. My pleasure.
Great, thank you so much. Of sight into everything that's happening in Latin America.